What do a vacation, an episode of The Twilight Zone, and a flight have in common? Hi, I'm Neferkefri, your hostess with the ghostess, and you're watching True Tales of the Paranormal. This particular tale comes from an experience my father had. My dad came from a family, he was one of 7 siblings. And at the time that this experience occurred, he had 2 sisters and 2 brothers who lived in Southern California. And the rest of his family still lived in Mexico. So it was early summer, and he decided to go on a 2-part vacation to see his family. The first leg of his trip was going to take him to Los Angeles to see his family who lived in Southern California, his 2 sisters and his 2 brothers. And then the second leg of his trip he would take a week later, would take him to Guadalajara, Mexico, to see his other brother who was still living in Mexico. My parents and I were big fans of the TV show The Twilight Zone. I still am. And this was back in 1979, and the show was in wide syndication at that point, and we were watching it on, I believe it was WGN out of Chicago. And there's a particular episode. And in the episode, there's this young dancer, and she's in the hospital due to exhaustion. And, she gets better, she gets out of the hospital, and she's going to take this flight. Well, while in the hospital, she had a nightmare that she's in a morgue. And the nurse opens these doors of the morgue and says to her, "There's room for one more, honey." And the dancer screams her head off, wakes up from the nightmare. Okay. A little bit of time goes by. She's well. She's taking a flight. And she is going up the stairs to the airplane, because back then they took much smaller planes. And so, you went up on the stairs on the tarmac there to get into the airplane. And the stewardess, who is standing at the top of the stairs, looks exactly like the woman in the dancer's nightmare and says to her, "There's room for one more, honey." And the dancer screams her head off, runs down the stairs, back into the airport, where she watches the plane, upon takeoff, burst into flames. Okay, this is a case of someone who had a premonition, and her dream was trying to warn her in a bit of a roundabout way to avoid this flight. And so my dad, when he was going to go on this trip, he was really excited. He had not seen his siblings in this was 1979. The last time we went to California, I was 3. That would have been in 1966. So he hadn't seen any of his siblings in 13 years. Okay, so it's been a good while. And so a couple days before the flight, my dad told me, just in kind of an offhand way, he says, "I don't know what it is, but I feel funny about my vacation coming up." I'm like, "What do you mean, Dad? What do you mean you feel funny?" He says, "I don't know. I just kind of get a weird feeling like maybe something bad's going to happen." And I'm like, "Oh, nothing bad's going to happen, And I was only 13 at the time. I had only been on a plane prior to that, like one time. So, we weren't big travelers by any stretch of the imagination, because we didn't have much money. And so for my dad to go on this trip, we had to save for quite a while for his plane tickets. It was a big deal. It was a big expense for us. I grew up rather poor. And so I told him, everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it. And then later that night, I overheard him telling my mom the same thing. "I got a funny feeling, and I feel like something bad's going to happen." She said the same thing I did. "You're just nervous because you're leaving us alone here. Don't worry about us. Everything's going to be fine. You go, you have a good time with your family." So the day of the flight comes up, and we lived in Waukegan, Illinois. And so flying anywhere, you went to O'Hare Airport in Chicago, which still is, an hour, I forgot my geography. Chicago is an hour south of Waukegan. And so I remember dropping Dad off at the airport, and, Mom and I, we drive back home, and it was May 25th, 1979. That date has great significance. So file that away. And so now the rest of this experience comes from my dad's own point of view. He's in the airport, and they start to board his flight to LAX, and he starts to feel really sick to his stomach. Now, my dad, to be honest, would get travel anxiety anytime we went somewhere, if it was by car, by train, by bus, and especially on a flight. He'd always get a little bit of an upset stomach. So it's a DC-10. It's got close to 300 passengers, and they just started the boarding process. And so Dad knows he's going to have enough time to go to the bathroom. So he goes to the bathroom, he uses the bathroom, he feels better. He starts walking out of the bathroom. Now, prior to this, and what he hadn't told my mom and I, the reason he was having the bad feelings is because my dad was having nightmares. And he was having repeated nightmares of different people telling him he just needed to forget about the trip and stay home. We didn't know this, right? So he comes walking out of the bathroom. And another thing, my dad, I don't know if you pay attention to your dreams. Do you dream in color or do you dream in black and white? Supposedly, most people dream in black and white, although I don't believe that anymore because everyone I ask, they always say they dream in color. Well, my dad was one of the ones who dreamt in black and white. So did my mom. I always dreamt in color. So he comes out of the bathroom and he turns, and there's a woman leaning up against the wall next to the entry into the men's bathroom. And Dad, nods at her, and she says to him, "Why haven't you listened to us? We've told you over and over. Just stay home." And my dad's like, "What?" And then he quickly looked the woman up and down, and he said it was the weirdest thing. The woman was in black and white, as if she were on an old TV set or stepped out of one of my dad's black and white dreams. She's leaning against the wall, dressed nicely, a sweater, a skirt, nice shoes, had a purse over her arm, hair was done up. But she was in black and white, and everything else around her, the airport, all the other people and everything, my dad, everything was in color. And my dad kind of freaked out, and he backed away from her, and he goes over to his gate, and he's like, what do I do? What do I do? Because, we had saved all this money for him to be able to take this trip. So he gets up to the gate, and he's going to board next. And he just looks at them, and he says, "I'm sorry, I can't do this. Something's wrong." And they said, "Are you feeling okay? Do you need us to call someone for you?" And he's like, "No, I'm going to just call my friend and have him come get me. My daughter and my wife are on the way home already." And, this was the day, the days before cell phones. There was no way he could get a hold of us in the car to ask us to turn around and come pick him up. We had no idea any of this was going on, right? So my mom and I are driving, on the way home. We're about halfway home. And all of a sudden, I started to get a really bad feeling. And I looked at her, I said, "Mom," I said, "I feel like something bad just happened." She's like, "What do you mean?" I said, "I don't know. I just feel like something bad happened somewhere, and maybe a bunch of people just died." She's like, "What? Don't think that way. What's wrong with you?" And we keep driving home, right? So we get home, and our neighbor, my friend Jimmy, whom I mentioned in other videos, his dad is on our front stoop, just sitting there on our stairs. And we're like, "What the heck? What's Lenny doing here?" And we got out of the car. We're like, "What's up?" And he says, "I'm glad I caught you guys." He says, "Bob just called from the airport." And I'm like, "What? What do you mean? What's Dad doing calling you? His flight should have taken off." And He says, no, he says, he decided not to go. And we're like, what? And he says, that's not all. You guys, did you have the radio on in the car on the way home? We're like, no, why? My dad was set to fly on American Airlines Flight 191 that took off from O'Hare Airport on May 25th, 1979. As my dad stood in the airport, looking through the windows, watching the flight he had just refused to get on, he saw the plane take off. Within 5 minutes, the plane rolled onto its left side and crashed a little bit behind the airport. My dad stood there and saw this huge fireball rise up into the sky. He said it looked like an atomic explosion. And then my dad passed out. And next thing he knows, he's laid out on some cushions and he's doing okay. He's got a couple of people helping him. And a lady told him, you're the sole survivor. From what we've just seen, you're the sole survivor. And my dad had them call, I think it was a friend of his, and this guy came to go pick him up and bring him home. Meanwhile, Lenny's telling us what happened and that Dad's okay because he refused to get on the flight, and that it's all over the news. And we go in the house and turn on the TV, and sure enough, they're talking about this huge airplane crash that just occurred, and pretty much they're fairly confident and killed everyone on board because there was this huge fireball, and that's what happened. There were no survivors of American Airlines Flight 191 that took off from Chicago O'Hare on May the 25th, 1979. And for the rest of his life, my dad had a little bit of survivor's guilt. A little. His main issue was that he wasn't adamant enough with the airport staff doing the boarding. He should have explained better. He thought there was something wrong with the plane. That was his reason for not getting on. He said he felt that the bad thing that was going to happen was an airplane crash. And so last minute, he didn't get on the flight, especially after seeing the weird black and white woman outside of the men's bathroom. It's really a very disturbing story for me to tell to this day. My dad, he lived to be 73. He passed away in 2009. Because, I always wonder what happened if this weird black and white woman didn't appear to him in the airport. Dad more than likely would have still gotten on that plane, even though he had grave reservations about it. And I would have spent the rest of my life without my dad, and my mom would have been a widow. It's one of those things, it's not really a what if. It's more like it's more like coming to the realization that sometimes a dream isn't just a dream. Sometimes we are given warnings in our dreams. And it's up to us to be discerning enough to realize when that occurs. And it happened to my dad a number of times before that trip. And finally, whoever or whatever was sending my dad these nightmares, trying to prevent him from going on this trip, they finally had to materialize in the airport and to give him one final reminder to not get on that flight. And my dad was already totally freaked out by the way he'd been feeling. And then after seeing that weird woman in black and white, of course he wasn't going to get on that plane. And he didn't. American Airlines Flight 191 is one of the greatest disasters in American aviation history. All lives on board were lost. It took until 2009, which coincidentally or not was the year my dad died. It took that long for a memorial to all the souls lost on that flight to be erected in the field where the plane crashed. And it happened to be students of a 6th grade class who worked for 2 years to raise money for this memorial. So that's the story of how an episode of The Twilight Zone and a plane flight and some nightmares all had something in common. Remember, pay attention to your dreams. Take notes. You never know what your dreams are trying to tell you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, I ask you to give the video a like and subscribe to my channel. Please share it with your like-minded friends. The shares really help. And please drop a comment. Comments help with the algorithm and they show my video to more people. Thanks again for stopping by. This is Neferkefri, your hostess with the ghostess, and you've been watching True Tales of the Paranormal.